The Mesa Verde National Park has held the public's attention for over 100 years, from the first people to farm this land, to the settlers who discovered the cliff dwellings in 1889, to the about 500,000 people that visit the Mesa Verde National Park every year.
I'm Scott Ortman. I'm a professor of archaeology at the University of Colorado in Boulder.
My name is Jon Ghahate. I am from the Pueblos of Laguna and Zuni. I am of the Badger clan. I am an educator at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center in Cortez, Colorado.
I started doing research on the archaeology of Pueblo people, when I was maybe 25 years old. I worked at an organization based out of Cortez, Colorado for many years before completing a PhD and now moving here to the university.
Facilities like the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Crow Canyon Archaeological Center up in Cortez, Colorado. We combine understanding and theories of what science tells us, along with the narratives, origin stories of the indigenous populations to help us understand who the Pueblo people are, their continued legacy, the history, and all that encompasses them as a society. And that's my responsibility as it applies to my position at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center and previously my position as a museum cultural educator at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center.
The Native Americans, known as Ancestral Puebloan people, were the ones who built the architecture in the Mesa Verde region, including the famous cliff dwellings.
These communities are the ancestors of those who currently reside, these current 21 distinct Pueblo communities. These communities that are referred to as Pueblo have always been and continue to be predominantly agrarian societies that were autonomous. There were multiple languages that were spoken amongst these groups. There is evidence of trade and commerce, exchange of ideas and skill sets that allowed them to reside independent of one another, but still having some commonalities that they shared.
The term Pueblo was first applied to the descendants of Mesa Verde people by the Spanish conquistadors who began exploring what is now New Mexico in the 16th century. And they used that term Pueblo from the Spanish word for town to describe the settlements that these people lived in.
The ancestral Puebloan people showed their creativity and ingenuity in their community building, crafting, and most famously, their architecture. But what are the ancestral Puebloans' history in and around the Mesa Verde region? Before and after the Archaic period, the people who would be known as the Ancestral Puebloans were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They were constantly on the move, only living in temporary settlements, and relied on hunting as well as gathering plants for sustenance. Archaeologists believe that the ancestral Puebloan people settled in the Mesa Verde region by AD 11. During the late Archaic period, formerly known as the Basket Maker I period.
It's interesting that Basket Maker I is not in that sequence there. When Kidder created the classification scheme, he presumed that an additional time period that he would label Basket Maker I would eventually be discovered, but we haven't quite found it the way he imagined it, and so Basket Maker I has never been used. It's funny, the sequence begins with Basket Maker II.
The reason why the basket maker term is utilized as it applies to a timeline of human development particularly in the Southwest, there's a period of time before pottery is developed that seems to be the predominant source of container.
People began to experiment with plant cultivation and farming. This would become important as they transitioned to Basket Maker II period. Farming started to really take hold during the Basket Maker II period, and it changed the way the ancestral Puebloan people lived. While they still hunted animals and gathered plants, farming provided a more sustainable food source.
The landscape could support many, many more people as farmers than it could as hunters and gatherers. There's good evidence of this in the archaeological record that the adoption of farming, and especially the addition of pottery to farming that made boiled foods easy to cook, really led to a baby boom and a rapid growth of the population.
Farming also required more permanent homes to keep watch over the crops. During this period, archaeologists believe that there were two separate groups that settled in the western and eastern borderlands of the Mesa Verde region. The people who lived to the west, also known as Western basket makers, began to build pit houses, shallow, basin-shaped houses that were dug into the ground with sloping tunnel entrances. Inside the pit house, there was a central hearth that provided heat and light, and smoke from the fire went through a hole in the roof. Some pit houses showed evidence of architectural features that would become standard in later pit houses. Deflectors and wing walls. A deflector was a barrier built just south of the central hearth, for the purpose of shielding the fire from streams of air that blew through the entryway. Wing walls were low walls that extended from the sides of the pit houses towards the center of the floor. It helped control air circulation and subdivided the living area. The group that lived to the east are called Eastern basket makers. They used similar building techniques first seen during the Archaic period. At the start of the Basket Maker 3 period, people still lived in small farmsteads that were home to 1 to 3 households. This time saw rapid population growth. Archaeologists believe this was largely a result of immigration moving into the area. Around AD 600, descendants of early Western and Eastern basket makers began moving into central Mesa Verde region in large numbers. Ancestral Puebloans started to build pit houses that consisted of 2 chambers. The antechamber was smaller and used for storing tools, containers, and food. The main chamber was a larger chamber, used as a living space. As the population grew during this period, formations of early communities began.
Defining the edges of what a community was, where its boundaries were, who was in it and who was out, is pretty hard because we can't, of course, go and talk to people and ask them. Typically, what archaeologists would do is look for concentrations of physical traces of people's behavior. So people would look for an area where there's a whole bunch of small settlements close together, and they would tend to define communities as being those groups in space. And then once you've done that, then archaeologists would look more carefully at the pottery and other trash, the housing and other things like that to infer patterns of interaction within the community.
As agrarian societies expand and progress, there's a progression of distribution of labor. So as humankind becomes more sophisticated, skill sets become more specialized, there are perhaps more increase and diversity of division of labor. Coupled with that is the increased sophistication of language. And so this is what anthropologists and archaeologists look at into what constitutes a society, what constitutes a community.
This period is also when the construction of great kivas began.
It's an underground structure that was probably covered. Majority of the time, these structures were circular. They could range anywhere from 10 meters in diameter to up to 50 meters in diameter. The word kiva originates from the Hopis, our neighbors in Arizona.
Great kivas were community gathering spaces. They were typically roofed. They were sort of scaled up domestic residences. So think of it as an analogy to the family home, but it's the home for the whole community.
Majority of the Pueblos still have kivas as a place of ritual, of existential belief systems, perhaps synonymous with something that we might say would be a synagogue or a mosque, a place of worship, of ceremony.
They served as focal points of communities and may have eased tensions and promoted social unity. The ancestral Puebloan people began to use pottery for cooking and serving food, which meant they likely started to use less baskets than in earlier basket maker periods.
You can see that transition at some point in time where baskets are not the predominant tool or item that is made. You can see it gradually transition into pottery.
As we look into the Pueblo 1 period, people began to live in larger villages, and majority of the population was living in densely populated villages by the end of this period.
As Pueblo villages began to take shape in what archaeologists call the Pueblo 1 period, they got quite a bit larger. Estimates are maybe 150 people or so lived in them.
People began to build structures above ground, a change from the previous pit houses that were fully or partially underground. They also began to experiment with using stone to build housing. Large public buildings were becoming more complex, which reflects archaeologists' beliefs that religious, economic, and political institutions were being developed during this time.
My guess is that in these villages, ideas that we would call clans today were important. So clans are concepts that groups of people adopt. The people in a clan are not actual relatives, but they imagine themselves as relatives. They label themselves as relatives, and often in a community that has clans, you're not allowed to marry, someone within your own clan. So I suspect that clan groups that are sort of abstracted from actual families was one of the steps in the evolution of Pueblo society, and I think that was probably the dominant form of organization in these Pueblo I period villages.
Towards the end of the Pueblo I period, there was a sudden decline in population. According to oral traditions, people moved to areas south of the Mesa Verde region. Archaeological evidence indicates that people emigrated to present-day New Mexico, in and near Chaco Canyon, which would soon become important to the Mesa Verde region. In the Pueblo II period, there was a vast network that was centered on the Chaco Canyon, which connected the Mesa Verde region to new people, ideas, and goods. Archaeologists believe there were connections to larger and more complex social systems centered on Chaco Canyon during this time, though the full picture has yet to be unveiled.
It's very clear that Chaco Canyon was a center of devotion for Pueblo people, and that people from far and wide brought food, pottery, building materials of all sorts to Chaco Canyon to help create these structures. Chaco Canyon was a big deal in the Pueblo II period.
Great houses are the biggest well-known architecture that connects to the wider Chaco Canyon cultural development. 225 great houses were found over tens of thousands of square miles throughout the northern Southwest, including Mesa Verde region. Great houses were massive, multi-room, multi-story masonry structures with unusually large rooms and one or more kivas built inside. They served as community centers.
And the people who lived at Mesa Verde, you see buildings in several Pueblo II communities that are smaller versions of the great houses in Chaco Canyon. They have architectural details that convince me that they were architects from Chaco Canyon were part of designing those buildings. And I think it's very likely that people of the Mesa Verde area made pilgrimages to Chaco Canyon regularly during that period of time. What's still sort of puzzling about it is what the nature of the relationship of the local people to Chaco was. Chaco is very prominent in the oral traditions of Pueblo people today. One of the challenges is you know how they say that history is written by the winners often? So Pueblo history was also remembered by certain people with certain points of view about things that happened. I guess the relationship between how it worked politically and how it is remembered today in Pueblo communities, to me, is a really interesting and complicated question.
However, by AD 1140, Chaco-style great houses were no longer being built. Once again, the ancestral Puebloan people saw dramatic changes in short periods of time as they entered the Pueblo III period. There was evidence of less hunting of animals during this period, which may indicate that there were less animals in the region to hunt. Deforestation on the mesa tops led to water runoff that seeped into canyons below.
The geology that created the alcoves is pretty interesting. First, you have a high plateau that uplifted to create the Colorado Plateau and the Mesa Verde Cuesta itself. And then you have erosion, water flowing downhill, forming rivulets, and eventually forming canyons. And then as the canyons get deeper and they cut through the different layers of rock, they end up exposing a layer where basically the water table forms in the sandstone. And at the junction of a sandstone layer and a shale layer, the water that's percolating down through the sandstone will then come out and it will run into the canyon. It will create springs and seeps. Well, those springs and seeps then also create additional erosion in the sides of the canyons that sort of hollow out the sides and create these alcoves that Pueblo ancestors used as places to build the cliff dwellings.
Thousands of people were congregated into larger villages. Most villages were in canyon settings, around canyon heads, and on top of mesa tops. These villages were enclosed by thick walls, which defined village limits and may have been used for defensive purposes. There were new architecture, including new public buildings, which may have reflected new social and religious dynamics.
A lot of the communities of the Pueblo III era had a special kind of building in the center of them that usually had a D shape. Often they had a couple of kivas inside them, and the round part of the D often had a row of interconnected rooms running around the perimeter of the building. And these buildings are typically found at the edges of the canyons in prominent locations that were very visible to everyone else in the community. A few of these have been tested by archaeologists, and what they found inside them is evidence that they were homes of people who lived in the village, but obviously probably not the homes of your average person. Probably the homes of prestigious or authoritative people, folks who had an important position in the community, people who were responsible for organizing community life. Some archaeologists have argued that the D-shaped buildings reflect an effort of local leaders to reestablish Chacoan organization at a local scale. But no matter how you think about it, you just have to imagine people sort of struggling and trying to figure out what to do about the fact that Chaco Canyon had fallen apart.
The most popular of the new buildings were, of course, the cliff dwellings. Why create these cliff dwellings?
I think there's a couple reasons. One of them is that they are very good as passive solar environments. In the wintertime, when the sun is low and in the south, the sun shines into the alcove all day and warms it up and makes it very pleasant to be outdoors. And then in the summertime, when it's very hot, the sun is high and the roof of the alcove makes the whole village shady. Another aspect of the alcoves is that there is a spring in most of them, right? They're formed through the action of water and seeps and springs, so there's a water source inside the village. The alcoves are also obviously defensible. You can only attack them from one direction, so people know what direction attackers would be coming from. They could fortify themselves against it. There's pretty good evidence of conflict being an important issue for Pueblo people during Pueblo III. The clearest evidence has been found in villages outside of Mesa Verde in the Montezuma Valley to the north and west of Mesa Verde itself. There, excavations in several villages have found traces of battles. Archaeologists that first examined the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde commented on similar evidence from the cliff dwellings.
The cliff dwellings were built in the 1200s, yet by the 1300s, all the ancestral Puebloans moved and migrated away from the cliff dwellings. These cliff dwellings are a marvel of architecture and engineering, which begs the question, why did they move away?
Evidence that there was probably a drought in this region during that period of time. Drought is not just isolate. It probably affects larger groups of people, so other people may be hungry. So maybe they came to places like Chaco and Mesa Verde. I can rely on their generosity, or maybe I can steal it, or whatever it comes down to. Maybe there was just discontent within the community.
What occurred is that about 30% of the families were in land that could not produce a crop, and there were too many people on the good land just producing enough for themselves. And so as a result, there was a lot of hungry people with nowhere to turn.
Many cultures, many indigenous cultures have stories or narratives of understanding that they are in a continued migration. They are in a continued evolution of their society, that their journey is not finished.
What I would say is that Pueblo communities as we know them today are the communities that built up in the aftermath of what happened at places like Mesa Verde.
Where did they go? They simply migrated. Ancestral Puebloans moved south along the Rio Grande and settled in new homes in New Mexico and Arizona.
The current day Pueblo communities, that when they came down to what we now call the Rio Grande corridor, what they brought with them, the acquired knowledge that they had been passed on from their ancestors who had occupied and inhabited Chaco and Mesa Verde, that they brought all those same ideas and knowledge, being farmers, builders, having a construct of a community.
Intentionally building more communal villages. The whole community builds an apartment building together and they all share a kiva. Lots of changes, but generally in the direction of a more communal and egalitarian kind of society.
The Spanish arrived in the 1500s and conquered Native Americans in Mexico. After conquering Mexico, the Spanish headed to the north. They eventually found the Puebloan communities spread across the southwest region and conquered them. In 1680, the Puebloan people revolted against the Spanish, the leader of the rebellion being Pope. They planned the revolt through community work and organization, secretly passing messages from one community to another, and using string to coordinate the day they would enact their plans. The Puebloans were able to drive Spaniards south, which allowed the Puebloans to govern themselves for 12 years until 1692, when an expedition from the Sanis was sent out to reconquer. When the Spanish arrived, there were 300 different Pueblo communities living in New Mexico and Arizona. However, due to diseases like smallpox and violence that the Spanish brought, there are now 21 modern Pueblos today.
European colonization was very hard on Pueblo people.
There was a lot that was under potential threat when colonizers come in and say, the way you believe is wrong, the way you do things is wrong, that we're here to tell you that this is the way you should do things, and everything that you have is under potential threat.
Indigenous people had much less immunity to introduce diseases that the Europeans brought with them. And the account suggests that things like half of the population of a lot of villages would perish from a single epidemic that passed through, and that these epidemics came through several times in the first few centuries. Spaniards came with technological advantages, steel, armor, firearms, horses that people could ride. So definitely a military advantage that they used to subjugate indigenous people across North America.
And longer term, we've lost all these things. What happens is culture, society loses its identity.
All of that being said, Pueblo communities are still around and thriving today.
We're fortunate. We still live on our homelands. We work to ensure our languages are still spoken. They're spoken in our classrooms. And it's only through that right that's acknowledged with some difficulty by the United States government that we can instill and ensure that our culture exists.
Despite no longer living in Mesa Verde, many communities who are descendants of ancestral Puebloans still feel spiritually connected to the Mesa Verde region.
We don't speak for our ancestors. We speak because of them, because they were here, because they provided us with the knowledge, the wisdom, all the things that constituted a society. That's because of what they provided and they contributed and sustained that we are still here. And we take a responsibility to ensure that how we tell that story is respectful. That's why we work diligently to help others understand that science, along with the traditional narratives, although maybe not always collaboratively, they do support the better understanding that our ancestral Puebloan societies are not the Anasazi, but rather they are those who came before us.
Although people are not currently living in the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde today, present-day Pueblo people see the spirits of the old ones as still being there. And so when they go to visit the cliff dwellings, they see it as going to visit their relatives. And so when they approach a site, they will ask permission to enter. And when they go inside, they will act politely, as though they were a guest in someone's home, as opposed to explorers, running rampant through a place that has been abandoned or left behind. So for the descendants, Mesa Verde is not finished. It's alive and well, and it's a part of the world today, and the spirits of their ancestors are there, continuing to have their lives. Something I've learned from studying Pueblo history, the philosophical richness that's implied by studying it.
Resided here, they found ways to live as a society, they found ways to use the resources, but they didn't own the land. They were stewards of the land, and they certainly reaped the resources from it, but it was not a concept of I'm owning it. It was not the fact that it's mine to sell or give. It's just I'm fortunate to live on this land, I will use the resources, and it's my responsibility to use them wisely.
Over the course of their history, Pueblo people had some really deep insights into human nature and into human beings as social animals, and into ways of taking those things into account and creating societies that are functional and resilient and that can handle hardship.
That's the legacy of those who came before us.
It's important to realize as we marvel at the architecture left behind in the Mesa Verde region, these are not empty houses, but evidence of the lives that once lived there.